Have you ever looked at a crowd of people from all over the world and thought about how incredibly different we all seem? Different skin tones, different eye shapes, different hair textures. For centuries, we've used these visual cues to put humanity into neat little boxes. We built borders, laws, and entire social hierarchies around these boxes. But what if the instruction manual to build a human being completely destroys the very concept of those boxes?
That is exactly the kind of question that led to one of the most massive, mind-bending scientific endeavors in modern history. We are talking about decades of researchers traveling to the most remote corners of the planet, from isolated Pacific islands to Himalayan villages, from the Amazon rainforest to the Mongolian steppes. They wanted to collect the DNA of every distinct human population before globalization blurred the lines completely. And the data they got back was so fundamentally shocking that some of these brilliant scientists genuinely thought their multi-million-dollar sequencing machines were broken.
I love that. The data is so wild that the first instinct is, did we forget to plug the machine in properly? But seriously, what were they looking for? And what did they actually find that turned the scientific world upside down?
They were looking for the genetic basis of human variation, basically the biological blueprint of what we call race. But what the data revealed was that traditional racial categories have absolutely zero basis in genetics. When you strip away the superficial traits and look at the raw code, any two humans on Earth share 99.9% of their DNA. That remaining 0.1% is where all our differences live. But here is the kicker. That tiny fraction of difference doesn't map onto our social concepts of race at all.
Wait, let me make sure I'm grasping the scale of this. You're saying that if I compare my DNA to someone on the exact opposite side of the planet who looks nothing like me, our genetic blueprints are practically photocopies of each other?
Exactly. In fact, it goes deeper than that. The data showed that someone from East Africa might share more genetic similarities with someone from Southern Europe than they do with someone from West Africa. The neat, color-coded map of human races that we were all taught in school simply does not exist in our biology.
That completely shatters the narrative. But if that's true, where does all the genetic variety actually live? Because clearly, humans are diverse.
This was the discovery that really made jaws drop. The greatest genetic diversity on Earth exists entirely within the African continent. Not between continents, not between so-called races, but within Africa itself. Two individuals from neighboring villages in Ethiopia can be more genetically distinct from one another than a random Ethiopian is from a random Norwegian.
That sounds completely counterintuitive until you think about the timeline of human history, right? Because our species spent the vast majority of its existence exclusively in Africa.
Spot on. Modern humans have been around for roughly 300,000 years. For most of that epic timeline, we stayed in Africa. Populations mixed, isolated themselves, adapted, and built up this massive reservoir of genetic diversity. When a very small group of humans finally migrated out of Africa about 70,000 years ago, they didn't take all that diversity with them. They only took a tiny fraction.
It's like taking a cup of water from the ocean and assuming it contains every type of fish.
That is a perfect way to look at it. Or think of it like a bag containing 100 different colored marbles, which represents the total genetic diversity in Africa. If you blindly reach in and grab just 15 marbles and put them in a new bag to represent the people who migrated out, that new bag can never be more diverse than the original 100. Even if those 15 marbles multiply and spread across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, they are still just a small subset of the original diversity. The further populations moved from Africa, the less genetically diverse they became. Native Americans, for instance, who traveled the furthest, show the least genetic diversity of all.
Okay, but I have to play devil's advocate here. If we are all so genetically similar, and race is a biological illusion, why do we look so obviously different? Why do I have a completely different skin tone or eye color than someone from Stockholm or Beijing?
That is the ultimate question, isn't it? The answer is incredibly simple. Local environmental adaptation. The genes that dictate our skin color, our facial features, and our hair texture make up less than 0.1% of our entire genome. And, evolutionarily speaking, these changes happened yesterday. For instance, the mutation for light skin in Europe, that only showed up about 8,000 years ago. Blue eyes, between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago from a single ancestor near the Black Sea.
That is astonishing. We've had agriculture longer than we've had blue eyes. It really puts into perspective how superficial these traits are. We are basically looking at incredibly recent wardrobe changes that our ancestors put on to survive the local weather.
Exactly. Dark skin evolved to protect against intense UV radiation near the equator. Light skin evolved to help the body absorb more sunlight to synthesize vitamin D in cold, dark northern latitudes. And what's fascinating is a concept called convergent evolution. Populations in southern India and Aboriginal populations in Australia both evolved dark skin because they lived in intense sunlight, but they did it through completely different genetic pathways. They arrived at the exact same physical solution using different genetic tools.
So our bodies are basically just highly efficient problem-solving machines. But what about health? Because we constantly hear in medicine that certain races are more prone to specific diseases, like sickle cell anemia in black populations or Tay-Sachs in Jewish populations. Doesn't that prove that race has some biological reality?
It seems like it does, which is why that misconception is so stubborn. But genomic data dismantled that too. Those diseases didn't spread because of race, they spread because they offered a bizarre survival advantage against very specific, local environmental threats. Take sickle cell. The sickle cell mutation actually protects the carrier against malaria. Nature favored that mutation in West Africa because malaria was a massive killer there.
So it's not a black disease. It's an anti-malaria adaptation that happens to be common in a region where the people also happen to have dark skin.
Precisely. A doctor who assumes a patient has a certain genetic risk just because of how they look is practicing outdated science. A person from West Africa and someone from a malaria-heavy region in southern Europe might both carry that resistance gene, even though society calls them different races. Meanwhile, two people of the exact same race could have wildly different disease risks depending on exactly where their specific ancestors lived.
That is a massive paradigm shift. It makes you realize how dangerous it is to use a visual proxy for something as complex as human biology. But let's talk about ancestry, because today, everyone is obsessed with DNA testing kits, trying to figure out exactly what percentage of European or Asian they are. What does this global data say about our family trees?
It says your family tree is not a tree at all. It's a massive tangled web. There is no such thing as a pure race. There never has been. Whenever human populations have met throughout history, they have mixed. Modern Europeans, for example, are a genetic blend of at least 3 distinct ancient populations: early hunter-gatherers, incoming farmers from Anatolia, and pastoralists from the Eurasian steppes. None of those ancient groups knew they were European because Europe as a cultural identity didn't even exist yet.
It really exposes the absurdity of racial purity or nationalism. We are all walking mosaics of ancient migrations.
We are, and here is the most poetic piece of data from the entire project. When scientists calculated the mutation rates and traced the lineages back, they found that the most recent common ancestor for every single human alive today lived only about 3,000 years ago.
Wait, just 3,000 years? That's nothing. That's during the time of ancient Egypt.
Yes, if you go back just 120 generations, you will find one person who is literally related to all 8 billion of us. And if you go back 7,000 years to around 5000 BCE, we reach a point where every single person alive on Earth back then who has any living descendants today is an ancestor to all of us.
That is heavy. So, a farmer in ancient Mesopotamia, or a hunter-gatherer in ancient South Africa if their bloodline survived, they are my direct ancestors, and yours, and the ancestors of the person delivering my mail today.
Every single one of them. We do not descend from one specific ancient tribe, we descend from all of them. The borders we draw, the genetic lines we try to enforce, they completely dissolve under the microscope.
Which brings up a very dark, but necessary question. If the science is this definitive, if race is a total biological fiction, why did we invent it? And why is it still the defining metric of our modern world?
We invented it to justify power. In the 1700s and 1800s, European scientists tried to categorize humans the same way they categorize plants and insects. But their science was heavily infected by the politics of their time. They looked at the technological and social differences between global populations and, instead of attributing them to history, geography, or resources, They claimed those differences were due to innate biological superiority. It was a very convenient fiction. If you can convince yourself that another group of people is biologically inferior, it becomes incredibly easy to justify colonialism, slavery, and genocide.
They turned a cultural geographical circumstance into a permanent biological destiny. And even though the DNA proves they were entirely wrong, we can't pretend the fallout isn't real. Race might be a biological myth, but racism is a very real social reality.
Absolutely. Saying race isn't genetic does not erase the trauma, the economic disparities, or the lived experiences of people today. Society built systems around this myth for centuries. Wealth, health, and opportunity were distributed based on these fake biological categories. The consequences of the illusion are brutally real, but what the genetic data gives us is a weapon. It strips away the excuse of natural order. It forces us to admit that the inequalities in our world are entirely man-made, which means they can be unmade.
That is such a powerful takeaway. We can no longer hide behind pseudoscience to explain away inequality. When scientists finally laid out the genetic code of humanity, they didn't find boundaries. They didn't find hierarchies. They just found a beautiful, unbroken spectrum of adaptation.
They found one single, highly adaptable species, a family that wandered out of Africa, put on a few different environmental coats to survive the cold and the sun, and eventually spread across the globe.
It leaves you with a profound sense of responsibility. The science has finally caught up to the truth that we are one deeply interconnected family. The biological borders have been erased. The only question left is, how long will it take for our social borders to do the same?